Let's go.
Welcome back to Razmafzar TV. I'm really happy to have Bede back on our channel. Hi, Bede. How are you?
I'm well, thanks.
Today, we are going to talk about, we're going to start a series on bow construction. We already talked on this channel about different bows and types. Today, we are going to talk about bow construction specifically. And the first type, the first video today is going to be a general video on bow construction. Imagine we are like in Neolithic time or period or whatever, we are sitting, and then we just say, oh, hunting with spear. It's not very nice because we need to get close to the game or to predators. Or maybe we should just try to shoot at him something. And after, throwing stones and something, or possibly slinger, we are going to find out, oh, let's make a bow. So that's the first step for human beings, to make a bow. So I give the floor to Bede to start. Okay, Bede, we are in Neolithic time and we want to make a bow.
Well,
those bows.
I think bows originally were used probably in Paleolithic times. There's evidence from South Africa of arrows. And how do you tell an arrow from a very small javelin? It's because it's so small that you couldn't physically throw it effectively.
Yes.
But you can shoot it. And how do you tell an arrowhead from a javelin head? Because it's designed to fit on one of these tiny, small twigs. So 65,000 years is probably a rough estimate on how long. It could be as high as 75,000 years. But by Neolithic times, the stoneworking quality had gone up a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, like Old Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, they're chipping bits off and making razor sharp pieces of flint and whatever, which are good for scraping and making wooden objects. But
yes,
in Neolithic times, they started to polish the stone to make more precise, easily handled tools. And our first surviving bows are Neolithic, from northern Germany, southern Denmark, places like that. And England, the Stellamore bow and all these kind of things. And what they show is that when people decided to make bows, when they started making bows that survived, they'd already developed a fairly complex idea of how to do it. Now, if you go to South Africa today and you go to the Kalahari and you see the local people making bows, just a twig, it's bent, they put a string on it. But that bow is to shoot a poisoned arrow. So it doesn't have to knock down the animal. It just has to deliver a little sliver. They use iron now, but they would have used probably hardwood smeared with poison, as long as it went through the skin.
What kind of poison do they use?
They make poisons from various things. There are plants, there are insects that they grind up and they construct the poison from. Now, the poison isn't, we think poison, shoot, die. Actually, the poison gradually kills the animal. And what they do is they follow the animal and keep pressure on it, because human beings can run for a lot longer than most animals can. We're not as fast as the animals, but we've got much more stamina. So what they do is they basically keep it moving, which keeps the poison circulating in the blood, and gradually it becomes sicker and sicker and sicker, and then it falls over and they kill it. That's one form of archery. I think poison is greatly exaggerated in its usefulness in archery. They in some of the islands in Melanesia, they use poisoned arrows, but the poison in that case, whereas it was effective, probably by causing sepsis, it was more magic than an actual, we worked out if you put aconite in this, it's going to do this and do that. It was more, this is a bone that we've taken out of the grave of our ancestor, and it's all green and slimy, and this is magic and it's going to kill. Well, it probably does kill you, but not for the reasons they thought. So what happened in Neolithic times is they'd got to the stage where they're making bows well enough and arrows well enough that they're killing by usually hemorrhage. So a stone point going into a body will cut arteries and the animal will bleed to death. Now, it could be quick, it could be slow. There's people in America who like making stone arrowheads and primitive bows, and they have been able to shoot animals as big as bison and kill them. And not that kind of slow getting sick death from the poison, but they bleed to death within 20 minutes or something. So that's the kind of thing that people were doing. Now, because stone tools are a lot better than you might think for carving wood, what they would do. Now, I'm going to pick to give you an overview from several different cultures. So in ancient Egypt, they would take acacia trees of a roughly the right diameter, and then they would use sandstone devices. Like, imagine an upside down cone of sandstone on a handle, and you just rub down. It's like using sandpaper to sandpaper away everything that isn't a bow. It's not fast, but it works. I've seen an ancient Egyptian bow half finished. For some reason, they painted one end before they'd finished polishing the other. Maybe it was just to sit inside a container or something, and they decided it wasn't worth doing the other end, or maybe they actually did it that way. I don't know. I would imagine you would finish it and then paint the whole thing normally. So this was just a round piece of wood. Now, I've made that curved shape to indicate that it was curved at the tips, but it wasn't curved at the tips like a modern recurve bow. The tips curved back towards the archer. And the reason they did that was because that type of bow, if you left it strung for a long time, if it was just a simple wooden bow and a simple curve, it would take a set and follow the string. So when you took the string off, it would be the shape, almost the same curve as when the string was on. So somebody in Africa worked out that if you pre-bent the tips and then put the string on so that there was little or no tension in the string, the bow wouldn't follow. But you didn't have to string your bow up when you went to shoot something. You could leave the bow strung for a few days without any trouble. It was, thinking outside the box. We've got a problem. How do we fix it? And this was very common in Africa, Arabia. It's shown, bows like that are shown in Assyrian bas reliefs fighting the Arabs, where the Arabs are on camelback shooting these little bows that are curved back towards them when they string them. I've noticed on YouTube that sometimes people couldn't believe this or had never heard of it. And when they saw the bows unstrung, they assumed they were recurve bows, and they did their beautiful drawings and everything, but the bows are the wrong way around. This is exactly the reverse that happened when people first saw composite bows and decided that you put the string across there instead of bending it all the way around and putting the string on. So we've got basically simple wooden bows. The earliest ones are twigs or saplings, and you shave the thick end down so it bends the same as the thin end. Usually they're quite long, but a lot of people decided, and this was still being done in America when Europeans arrived, that actually if you're hunting, it's quite efficient just to have a bow you only shoot, like draw to about here. So why take a huge longbow when you can make a bow that's efficient at that draw length? In Egypt, the very early dynastic, like first, second, third dynasty type paintings and bas reliefs show bows that are only about that long, and they're holding bundles of arrows, and the arrows aren't very long either, so they probably only drew quite short, but then they get bigger. So these first group of bows I'm talking about are basically just round. If you could imagine a broom handle that's tapered at both ends, that's essentially what they were. They took into account how the grain came up in the wood and everything so that they wouldn't break. And they used relatively hard woods in, say, the southern Mediterranean area. In Europe, they tended for things like elm, which is super tough. It's very hard to break. Yew, which is good for energy storage and relatively easy to carve. There's quite a few other woods they used. In North America, they used even more because they had a really good selection of bow woods. In
Yes.
Asia, round about 4000 BC, up in the north in eastern Siberia, they found burials with very long bows in them, with little strips of antler all along the belly. Now, our experience making bows with antlers, and by our I mean bow makers in the US, where it's the most experimented on, because they actually had antler bows, they're all sinew backed. And these bows probably were relatively well-developed composites, but they weren't efficient compared to the later composites. Then you've got, in Arabic literature, they talk about several types of self-bow that were still known about in the 9th century, even though they were probably developed in Neolithic times, by which one thing is, say you've got a nice long piece of wood, well, you make a bow out of it. But say you've got a nice piece of wood, but it's not long enough, so you split it in two and then glue it together in the middle and tie it, and then you make a much longer bow, twice as long. And so they had that. Then at some time, people decided that you could glue two strips of wood together.
Yeah.
Because once you've got pottery, or you know how to make stone bowls, you can make animal glue. And animal glue is very strong, and you can get away with gluing together things that wouldn't normally stay together, because animal glue contracts as it dries. So even if you don't have elaborate clamps, it will glue the bits together. So you go from a round cross-sectioned simple bow, you go, people, this is one of Jürgen Junkman's Neolithic bows, and you can see that it's got a relatively, see how it comes in, it's relatively thin at the tips, but their thickness is slightly more than the bending parts, which means that you're changing the shape of the bow to make it more efficient without actually
What kind of wood is that? What kind of wood is that?
This is actually, I think he said it was hickory, which is an American wood, but the originals were made out of things like elm and some of the stiff pines.
What is the poundage on this bow?
This is about 60.
50.
It's actually very smooth to draw. It's smoother to draw than a longbow of 60 pounds because of this complex shape. But as they pointed out in the English book, The Great War Bow, these take longer to make. So when wooden bows started to be made for military uses, like English longbows, it's much more efficient to make the shape. You can make more out of one tree, and it takes less time to make each one. So there's a efficiency payback. If you're a Neolithic farmer and you've got the winter months where you can't do anything much, you're sitting in your hut trying to keep warm, then shaping a bow, it's not a bad idea. In New Guinea, where they still make medium to long bows, they can make a fully functional, efficient self bow in an afternoon. And that's, now they use a steel machete, but like in the 1920s, they found about 1 million people living in the center of New Guinea that nobody knew about. And they were still using stone tools, and they could do all this stuff. So it's a bad thought to think that you can not do complex bow making with stone tools. You certainly can. And not only that, aside from people that are doing it out of their culture, there's groups of people in the US and in Germany and other places where they've rediscovered how to do this, and they can make efficient bows in a day or two. I mean, that's, I'm not taking into account seasoning and things like that, but it's much more straightforward than people living in cities and using electric machines to shape their wood and everything. We kind of think it's really hard to do if you don't have those machines, but in fact, it's actually sometimes it's easier to do without them. It's just that we bought these machines and we want to use them. But as I was saying, people glue together strips of wood to kind of make a more efficient bending structure. And there's photographs from the 1920s of people in eastern Siberia making bows that way. And they wrapped crisscrossed strings the length of the bow and put wedges in to put pressure on it as the glue dried, which is very similar to what the Japanese do when they make bows, except the Japanese bow is much more complex in its shape and its cross-section. But these people have been making bows this way for thousands of years. And you say, well, they're just primitive villagers, but they could make complex bows. And we kind of, again, we think you've got to have workshops and specialized tools and all that kind of thing. But it's not true. If you've got your basic tools and you know how to use them and you know what you want the bow to do. Now, the bow that a Neolithic person made, that bow shoots very well. You can shoot out to, 70 meters with it without too much trouble. So it would be effective, if you were in a confrontation with the next village and nobody's wearing armor and you've got really sharp flint arrowheads, then that bow's a serious weapon. And self bows, we talk about self bows, it's only a piece of wood. They can't be that good. The Egyptians used Nubian archers well into the New Kingdom period. And in the New Kingdom, composite bows were introduced into Egypt. So they had super efficient composite bows. But they still could use Nubian archers using simple deflex tip wooden bows, usually acacia and things like that. And they were really valuable troops because not everybody has to be super elite.
Yeah.
It's, if you can bring 10,000 archers into battle and their bows shoot, only 3/4 of the way of everybody else's bow. If you've got guys in front with shields, they can wait till everybody else has used up their very expensive arrows and their very expensive bows. And then you've got 10,000 guys that can keep shooting at them once they get close enough to do damage. See, we kind of, the tactics, the way people use people in battle are very different. And when we're talking about certainly these early primitive bows, they were basically designed for hunting and they were kind of ramped up for war usage. Yes. You might only take a 50-pound bow out when you go out hunting, but the man that can make a 50-pound bow can make a 100-pound bow. And if you've got, the muscles and you train, you become a really efficient archer. Now, when you start, the people in Siberia were making these laminated bows, but they were still basically hunting bows. But once you start laminating strips of wood together, somebody's going to come up with the idea, what happens if you put sinew on one side and horn on the other?
Yes.
The bows get a bit shorter.
Explain where you put the sinew, where you put the horn again, please.
Okay, so on a regular wooden bow, like this one, the back of the bow is the part that faces away from the archer.
Yeah.
And the belly of the bow is the part that faces towards the archer. Now, the back, when you bend the bow, the back lengthens.
Yes.
And the belly is contracted. So if you measured the length of the bent bow, it would be longer on the back than it was before you started and shorter on the belly side. So somebody worked out that some things are really good in compression. And one of them is horn.
Yeah.
And some things are really good in tension, which sinew is. Now, just recently they've published a study of some arrows and bits of bowstring found in Spain, Neolithic.
Mhm.
And the latest thing that I've read about it suggests that the bowstrings are made from animal sinew, twisted together in thread, not like chunks of sinew, but it's been broken down into fine threads and then twisted together into string. Now, once if you're familiar with sinew, which you have to be to make thread out of it, it's not a huge leap of saying, well, what happens if we glue some sinew strings to the back of our bow? And what happens is your bow is less likely to break. It doesn't make it more efficient because sinew is heavier than wood for the same amount of energy storage, but it stops it from breaking. And American Indian tribes worked this out a long time ago, so that quite a lot of the short bows would have a very thin covering of sinew on the back. And I mean thin, a millimeter or so.
Yes.
But somebody found out about horn, and it is possible they started with antler because, as I said, 4000 BC, they found bows with antler strips on them. Now, antler is not very good at compression in the sense it doesn't contract, but it doesn't break either. So if you make a bow with a strip of antler, say reindeer antler, caribou in North America, and you get 2 long strips of that, because they've got huge horns, you can get really long strips of it. And you join them together at the handle, and you put a thick layer of sinew, much thicker than on a composite bow, then you can move all of the bending or all of the stress from the belly to the back. So that thick layer of sinew does all the energy storage, and the antler bends, because you make the antler very thin, it bends not proportionately very much, but it's enough for the bow, and all the energy stored in the sinew. So you get various transitional types of bow from different periods and different places. See, the advantage of North America is almost all of them still survived into the 18th and 19th centuries. So you can actually go to museums and see these bows, whereas in Europe and Asia, all that's left is little bits of horn or bone or whatever. So that's why America is really important for understanding Europe and Asia, because it maintained a lot of these technologies long after everybody had forgotten how to do it. But at some stage, and we know from the bas relief, I think of Sargon of Akkad in about 2100 years before the present, not before the present, before the current era, BCE, that they had started to make proper composite bows, which is a wooden core with horn on the inside, the belly side, and sinew on the outside. Now, they weren't very sophisticated, but the thing is that horn and sinew may be heavier than wood, but it can store a lot more energy because it compresses or stretches more than wood would without breaking. So you make a bow that's 1.5 meters long, you can make it relatively thick, which means that it moves faster when you let go of the string. But because of the horn and sinew, it doesn't break. If you made a wood bow with the same proportions, you could draw them that far. But you make a horn and sinew bow, you can draw it this far. And the longer the draw is, the more energy goes into the arrow, the more dangerous it is. And it's primarily designed for warfare. So there's a point where you go from simple wooden bows to laminated bows and then to composite bows. And composite bows are primarily designed for warfare. They certainly were used in the hunt, because when a prince has got this lovely bow, he's going to go out and hunt things. And in the Middle East, there were still elephants to hunt.
Yeah.
There were still lions to hunt.
Yeah.
There are still leopards wandering around. So there was big game. It was dangerous. It made the prince or the king look really important when he comes home with a dead elephant or something. And so composite bows are primarily war bows, but were still used in the hunt. And the reason that they weren't like in the same level as wooden self bows is because they took more resources to make, And whereas the amount of work you did was comparable, it had to be stretched out over much longer periods of time because of the fact that the glues had to dry, and they often took weeks. The thicker the sinew layer, the longer it takes to dry out. So it was a bigger investment in time and resources. That doesn't mean that tribal people couldn't make composite bows at home. They did. But and probably that's where they came from. Probably they came from tribal people. Then they got into these Bronze Age empires and they elaborated them. But it's important to point out that despite the fact that you've got these very complicated and very efficient bows, there's still places that are still using self bows. England. I mean, the advantages of using a self bow in England are cost, availability of materials, though towards the middle of the Middle Ages, they had to start importing yew to make bows because they cut down most of the good stuff. And it's efficient enough. You don't have to be able to shoot 300 meters in a battle. It's good enough to shoot between 100 and 120 and still be able to kill people. So therefore you kind of, you've got to see, people want to rank things and say, oh, this bow is better than this bow is better than this bow, but it all depends on the circumstances.
Just one question. So, you know, sinew on one hand, horn on the other side, sinew. What happens, just in a hypothetical question, what if I have a piece of wood and I make a bow, south bow, and I start, I know you shouldn't do that, but wrapping sinew around it all the way around, what happens?
Well, what people tended to do was, rather than wrap it all the way around, they discovered they just had to put it on the back in a long strip.
I know, but if you put it everywhere, wrap it around,
it makes the limbs heavier and the bow less efficient. It probably won't break as long as there's some longitudinal fibers in there, but sinew weighs more than wood, so it just makes it heavier. It's like when you see modern bows that they want to make look like a Hun bow or a Hungarian bow, and they make a fiberglass bow and they put wooden ends on it, and then they cover it with thick leather. That thick leather just slows the bow down.
Another question. Can I make bow arms of antler? Just put get a big horn and try to polish it and use it?
Yeah, but you'd only be able to draw it about there before it broke.
Yeah, it breaks. You're right.
The sinew is the safety material to stop things from breaking. And when you get in a horn and sinew bow, it's also the energy storage place. But say, for instance, composite bows from India, the type that's called a crab bow, they worked out that if you made a horn and sinew bow the normal way and left the horn out from the second half of the limbs and wrapped them in sinew, as the sinew contracted, it formed like it wasn't tube shaped, it was triangular shaped because it was like the Hassan on a Turkish bow, but it contracted in against the wood and made the wood less able to break. And they got to a point where you could get the right balance of sinew and wood in the latter halves, the gusha of the bow, that it used less of the expensive horn and things like that, but still performed like a normal horn bow. And these bows they last for a century or two.
Yeah.
And in India, particularly, I mean, like in the Rajput areas, lots of dry country, so you're not really worried about it. But everywhere there are patches of jungle, there's places that are very moist. So they learned how to make very thin silver foil, wrap it and glue it down over the sinew, and then paint over that, so you had waterproof bows. I mean, it was, you had a problem and they worked out how to solve it. In places like Iran or Turkey or Manchuria, Mongolia, they didn't have as big a problem with moisture.
Yes.
I mean, Guilan province, yeah, that would be a bad place. But
Yes, it is.
but
Very.
the rest of Iran, you've got lots of dry bits.
Yes.
And campaigns. I remember. I think it's either in Taibuka or Arabatri, where he comments about talking about using crossbows. It was Taibuka. That they're not good for campaigning, and then he adds in the desert, because everywhere you had to go, you had to cross the desert to get there in the Middle East at some stage or another. So therefore, composite bows, even badly made, would still survive the desert pretty well. But that was a more difficult thing.
Okay, very good, Bede. Just the last point for today, because today is only instruction. In the follow-up videos, we are going to go more into detail. Just tell us the bowstring, which materials could be used, or they used for bowstring, different cultures.
Okay.
Sorry.
Bowstrings, there's a huge variety, and this is really amazing when you think about it. Once people learned how to make string from fibers, they made string out of everything they came across.
Yes.
In Australia, Aborigines made ceremonial belts out of human hair. They would twist it into thread and make a belt. And there's actually comparably, I'm trying to remember whether this is a Greek reference or a Chinese reference or both, talking about, there's a Greek reference to women in a besieged city cutting their hair and giving it to the guys making catapults to make the twisted ropes that Greek catapults used. So hair is quite good, and horsehair is another thing you can make it out of. I mean, I've got Mongolian strap that's made out of braided and twisted horsehair, and this was
for a string.
Well, yeah, they make string and then they braid or weave the string into thicker pieces. Well, we know from the Spanish discoveries, but we also know from Arab and Turkish and Persian stuff, you can make sinew bowstrings.
Yes.
Sinew is incredibly strong. And it goes further. Like the Inuit people in Alaska made braided sinew cords, very, very long cords, that they tied onto harpoon arrows when they were hunting seals. So not only did the sinew survive being shot at the end of an arrow and the seal dragged, they had like a float on it so that they could follow the seal until it was tight enough that they could kill it. But it survived exposure in the ocean, in the Arctic.
Yes.
And according to what I was told by somebody who had some of these and talked to the people that made them, so he wasn't just making it up, they put blubber, fat, from either the seals or whales or whatever they could kill, and they rubbed it into the sinew to make it waterproof. Because I looked at it, not everything I'd been told was you put sinew in water and it'll unravel and come apart. And I said, but there's a way of doing it. So sinew was one thing. Rawhide is another. I've seen close-up rawhide strings made for, one of the Chinese emperors of the Qing dynasty, Qianlong, one of his hunting bows had a twisted rawhide bowstring. Now, bear in mind, Manchu bows were very heavy, and this was, like 7 millimeters thick or something. It was not a small bowstring, but rawhide is effective. I, with Dr. Grayson, experimented making sheep gut bowstrings, work perfectly. And then you go on to natural fibers, hemp bowstrings, linen bowstrings.
Linen, yes.
Silk. There are some cotton bowstrings, and of course, the most expensive was silk bowstrings.
Yeah.
And I've made silk bowstrings. They are as good as, I think it's B50 Dacron.
Oh.
So they're as good as modern materials. There are better modern materials for making bowstrings, but my experience with silk bowstrings, I've never broken one. I've used them with. Look, I haven't used them with over 80-pound bows, but I don't think there was any problem there. I've got an old Turkish one from the 17th century, and it looks like it was made yesterday, and it wasn't. I'm pretty certain. And you can experiment yourself. You can buy silk and make bowstrings out of it. Actually, I should make one for one of my modern Turkish bows and test it and compare it. Just do a video of it would be quite interesting.
Sure.
But the thing is that is there anything there camel skin, but that's just rawhide. So different animals. The Arabs in North Africa pointed out that I think it was a young camel who'd starved over winter, had particularly good skin for making bowstrings. I think the starved over winter was less fat in the epidermis, but I don't know. Fat might actually make a better bowstring. So lots of materials, plant materials, animal materials, processed different ways. They all work. Some are. I think the bowstrings they found in Egyptian tombs were generally identified as sinew.
Yes.
But after 3,000 or 4,000 years, it's a bit hard to tell the difference between sinew and gut because they both turn into a kind of jelly, which is essentially the breakdown of the protein in the material. But yeah, a very large range. So if you want to make a hemp bowstring, the Japanese still make hemp bowstrings, and because Japanese bowstring technology is very sophisticated, they're really good, very thin strings. I think there's a reference in Mahdi to the Egyptians using thin, very hard bowstrings made out of vegetable fiber in the 12th, 13th century. It may also be in Arab archery. I think there's a mention in that because he discusses some people use thin bowstrings, some people use thick bowstrings, and it depends on the material because if the material you're making the bowstring out of isn't very strong, then a thick bowstring may be the solution to it. But they had other reasons for doing that. But there you go. There's a big range of materials to make bowstrings out of, and they didn't change much as bows developed. They had perfected bowstrings really early on. The big changes were when they started making like Turkish, Chinese, Persian bowstrings, the triple looped bowstring that we found in the manuals. When they started putting separate pieces in the ends of the string for wear and tear, because that's a place where there's a lot of wear and tear on the bowstring. That was probably the last big development in bowstrings. Modern bowstrings is just a change in materials. The endless loop style was invented certainly around the 8th or 9th century in the current era. And tying separate loops into that came in fairly quick. The twisted type of bowstring that in like English is called a Flemish bowstring, which is made of twisted fibers. A lot of bowstrings were made that way. The ones from Spain look as though they're made that way. Certain of the Chinese ones were made that way too. And there's references in Persian and Arabic literature to making bowstrings that way. So there's a huge range, but they're all basically things that were invented quite early on. Just string is really efficient.
Thank you very much, Bede, for this general introduction into bow construction. Later on, we are going to continue this talk and go from different materials used for each bow construction again and go more in detail. Would you like just to say anything to our viewers today before we finish it?
Well, basically, don't judge a bow by thinking it's primitive or advanced. People making advanced bows made mistakes, and people making primitive bows sometimes made superb bows. It's how it performs, not what it's made of.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Bede, and thank you very much, and I wish you a nice day.
You too.